Alright guys, what is the crack? You are very welcome to another episode of the From the Depths podcast. As always, my name is Emmett, and you're very welcome to another week and another episode of the show. So as you can probably gather from the title of today's episode, we are ploughing on and continuing on with our look back, our retrospective of the George Romero Dead films. I said on the first episode I was only going to look at the first three, and that is still the case. I'm going to conclude this little retrospective on this week's episode of the show with 1985's Day of the Dead. This is a film that, very much like last week's film that I covered, Dawn of the Dead, it was a film that I was watching for the first time. Did I enjoy it as much as Dawn of the Dead? To be honest with you, no. But when it comes to quality, these films are the last film, Dawn of the Dead, and this film, Day of the Dead, very close in overall quality and stuff like that. I'll tell you one just before we go on with the rest of this week's episode and stuff like that. When it comes to these three films, I was overly familiar, if that makes any sense, with Night of the Living Dead. It's one of my favourite films of all time, as I've said 110 times over the course of the last two episodes of the show. Dawn of the Dead, out of the three of these films, is the one that people were continuously recommending that I check out months ago, around the start of the pandemic. I remember putting out a post on Instagram saying I wanted to get into a horror film, what films should I be checking out and stuff like that. And of course a lot of people were throwing the classics like, Halloween, Hellraiser, Child's Play, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, or The Exorcist. All these films are being thrown at me, but weirdly enough, Dawn of the Dead was being thrown at me more than Night of the Living Dead, which I found quite strange. And this film, out of the three, I find is the one that doesn't really get as much love. It is still romanticised and stuff like that, and people look back at it fondly and stuff like that. But when compared to the first two, it's not looked at as in such high regard. And a weird one then was, I remember a month back when I threw up that post saying I was going to cover these films over the course of a few podcasts, more of he reached out and showed excitement over the fact that I was going to be covering Day of the Dead than he did the other two films, which again I found quite strange. But after watching the film this past weekend, I totally understand why. Day of the Dead is a fucking fantastic film. Do I prefer it to Night of the Living Dead? No. Do I prefer it to Dawn of the Dead? No. But does that mean it's a bad movie? Not at all. All three of these movies in the Dead series are very different, and you probably scratch your head thinking, what? They're all zombie movies and they pretty much have the same premise. And you know something, you're right to a certain extent. It's just a lot of people trying to not get killed and eaten by zombies, but they do all differ in very different ways and stuff like that. Like Dawn of the Dead, outside of premise and stuff like that, is a very different film to Night of the Living Dead, just in the same way that outside of like the simple premise, Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead are two very different movies too. But that's what we're going to touch on throughout the course of this week's episode of the podcast. I'm going to give you my thoughts on Day of the Dead, as well as then I'm going to talk a little bit about the production of Day of the Dead. I'm going to talk about its legacy, and then I might probably wrap stuff up by trying to compare and contrast the three films a little bit. I won't make any promises though, because I said I was going to throw a hot take at the end of last week's podcast, and over the course of recording it, I totally forgot what the hot take was meant to be. It was something relating the threat of the zombie pandemic that's going on in Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. I was going to compare and contrast it to what's going on with COVID and everything like that. But to be honest with you, I think if you watch these movies back in light of everything that's been happening for the last 18 months, I think you can put those comparables together for yourself. And I think retrospectively, with everything going on, watching these films now, it's just kind of like, you see the stupid decisions that people are making in regards to survival and stuff like that. And you know something, it's kind of, it was foreboding, because we've seen people make very similar stupid decisions over the course of this pandemic, and it's costing them their lives, ignoring safety guidelines and stuff like that, thinking it was all propaganda, and then they find themselves in an ICU machine. Obviously not the case for everyone, but definitely the case for some. Anyway, and you're going to try and not go down that rabbit hole, not to go down that tangent. Yeah. Anyway, what I'll do is, to start off this week's podcast, I'm going to get the housekeeping out of the way so that I don't have to do it in the middle of the podcast like I did last week. So if this is your first time listening to the From the Depths podcast, you are very welcome. If you've been with us from the very start, you're very welcome back to the show. If you've hopped on somewhere along the way, we're very happy to have you as well. If you've been enjoying the podcast, thank you very much. and I enjoy putting them out. I enjoy putting them together. It's just a bit of crack on my end. Don't do it for profit or anything like that. I just do it to have an excuse to start conversations about metal bands, metal albums, and now horror films as well. I've had a few people reaching out asking me when the metal podcasts are going to be back. What I've decided to do is, time permitting, I may cover one more film and then call it a day with the films for a while, and do that for next week's podcast. But if I don't have time, I will do a very, very simple retrospective, a metal related retrospective. But we'll see how things are. Time is very much of the essence for me at the moment. I'm trying to put together a portfolio for college. I am wrapping up my placement, which will mean I'll actually have more free time during the week as well. So I may, for a week or two, I may throw out a bonus episode of the show, or at least try and do one or two highly detailed retrospectives if I can. I might cover a band like Deep Purple or something like that over the course of 2 hours, throw in some soundbite stuff, but we'll wait and see. I am thinking out loud anyway at the moment. But yeah, so what was I going to say? If you've been enjoying the show and everything like that, and you want to help the show grow in any way, it's always, I'd be very, very thankful if you had those thoughts, or if you had that intent and wanted us to succeed. But the handiest way to help us out would be liking our Facebook page, and by following our Instagram account. You can like our Facebook page by following at From the Depths Metal Radio, and then you can follow us on Instagram at From the Depths Metal. That is the easiest way to keep up to date with the podcast. It's the easiest way to keep up to date with everything that I'm doing with From the Depths. And I do an odd bit of record sharing on there. I throw up the odd video clip in relation to a film or and albums and stuff like that I'm going to be covering over the course of podcasts and everything like that. So yeah, the handiest way to keep up to date and see what's going to be on the next episode of the show is by following those social media accounts. And I'll tell you, as I've said before on several episodes of the show in the past, the more people that like and share posts and stuff like that, the easier it is for us to get interviews with kind of more higher caliber artists and stuff like that, if you understand what I mean. And to give context to that, like I have before, a lot of bands and stuff like that now, given that we're towards the end of this whole pandemic, regards to the quarantine and stuff like that anyway, are going to be releasing a lot of albums. 2022 is going to be a very, very busy year for heavy metal, and a lot of those bands are going to be putting out albums towards the end of this year, and a lot of those bands are going to be going on promo cycles towards the end of the year into early 2022 before they all start touring again. And given the fact that no one has really toured or played or released anything, bar a handful of bands over the past 12 months, they are going to be sizing up their options when it comes to their publicity cycle. Like they'll all these bands and stuff like that, to do a promo cycle when they're putting out albums. They hop on a podcast like this. They go on to metal radio shows. They do interviews for magazines and fanzines and YouTube channels and all this kind of stuff. And for a lot of those bands, it's not really worth their time doing these interviews with certain sites and stuff like that if the site doesn't have the draw. And it's not like, it's not worth an artist. Like, it's not worth, like, I'll give you an example now. I'd never look for this artist to be on the show, but let's say like Corey Taylor was doing a solo album and stuff like that, and we applied From the Depths to have him on the show and everything like that, even for 20 to 30 minutes. The fact that we have less than like 1,000 followers on Instagram would pretty much mean that we wouldn't even get a response in that. Now, again, I'm not going to be looking for Corey Taylor to be on the show, and I'm not looking for 1,000 Instagram followers or anything like this. But the more followers we have, it makes it easier for those things to happen. I had a very, very exciting artist confirmed to come on the show. And then over the course of over the course of 3 weeks, we had a slot for an interview sorted. And I'm not really flexible with that anymore with college and work and everything like this. And they wanted to change it. So I changed it twice, and that was all good and everything like this. And the third time around, they asked me to change it the third time, and I was like, I really can't change it. We're working college. And they were like, look, you're really not in a position to dictate this. They were like, we have a promo cycle to do. It's either on this date or you don't have it. And I had to turn around to them and unfortunately be like, well, I'm sorry, I can't do it then. I won't say who the artist was, because just because that happened this time around doesn't mean that we won't get to interview them at another point during another promo cycle, or maybe even if they're in Ireland at some point. And it's, yeah. But anyway, my whole point of that is, if you can help us grow the social media accounts in any way, it really, really does help. And it really helps further our reach with the podcast, get more people on. And yeah, it gets more people into the podcast too. And, you know, it's all well and good, I'll be totally honest with you. It's all well and good. I really enjoy making this podcast and stuff like that. But since taking the break, man, in April, over the circumstances I'd taken, it's been so fucking hard to get the listenership back. It has been really, really hard. And that's why I'm so thankful that I didn't do it for reach or anything like that, or for, like, I'm not overly concerned about the listenership or anything like this. But man, it can be like, and I know everyone, like, this is the same for artists too. I could do a fucking podcast alone on this. Anyone who's in a band, anyone who runs does a podcast or anything like that, you know, you have that initial thing at the start where you have lots of people hopping on and they want to see it because it's new, and then it's around for a while and it drops off again. And I know that that's probably the case because I haven't had interviews for a while. But they will be coming back, especially now that these retrospective things are coming to an end with regards to films and stuff like that. And my laptop as well, which was out of commission for a few weeks, it should be back in working order as well in the next 2 weeks. And that's the case. What that means then is as soon as I have the laptop back, I can use Zoom. I mean, as soon as I can use Zoom, that's when the interviews come back. Because it's not really possible to do interviews in person yet. It's nothing to do with circumstance or everything like that. Things have just reopened as well. So people would rather go out and socialise and see their friends and see their families, which I totally don't blame them. I've been doing the same. So the chances of me actually sitting down interviewing someone, it'd probably be another 2 to 3 weeks. Once the novelty of stuff being open again kind of goes away, and people realise that they're spending over €100 a week in the pub and in the restaurants, they kind of be like, oh shit, we can't really be doing this for the whole of the summer. That's when I'll be able to worm my way back into interviews. Anyway, I'm after going on a tangent that's after taking up for 11 minutes of the show. Let's get back to the topic at hand. Let's get back to what we're supposed to be talking about this week. We are talking about 1985's Day of the Dead, written and directed by Mr. George A. Romero. So before I start talking about this movie in any way, as I did for the last 2 movies we covered on the podcast, I am going to give you a little listen to the trailer. So yeah, this is the trailer for 1985's Day of the Dead.
First came the night, then came the dawn. Now comes the most eagerly awaited day in horror film history. George A. Romero's Day of the Dead.
We've been punished by the Creator. We visited a curse.
Hello! Is anyone there?
For the few remaining, their only hope of survival is to find a cure.
You're wasting time trying to define what's happening.
But the odds are against them.
We're in the minority now. Something like 400,000 to 1 by my calculations.
And so is Captain Rhodes.
Anybody else have any questions about the way things are gonna run around here from now on?
Their one chance is Bub.
It's working on instinct. A deep, dark, primordial instinct.
But their time is running out.
They can be fooled, don't you see? They can be tricked into being good little girls and boys. The same way we were tricked into it and promised some reward to come.
But when the tricks wouldn't work,
They're learning. They're actually learning.
their world fell apart.
Let him go! God damn it! I'll cut you in half.
Shoot that woman or you're dead.
It wasn't very nice, you know. That wasn't very nice at all. You can just sit there in the dark, think about what you've done. Think about it. Think.
The dead shall have their day. Day of the Dead.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
Alright, so that was the trailer for 1985's Day of the Dead. Before we go any further, I just want to give you a heads up. I don't know if this is going to be picked up on the microphone. It might not be, but I'm hearing it pretty loudly. It is raining outside of the place that I'm recording this podcast right now. It's being picked up a little bit on my mic. I can hear it a small bit, so if you hear that at any point throughout the rest of the episode, my apologies. Anyway, just being nice and giving you the heads up on that one. So we're talking about 1985's Day of the Dead, again written and directed by Mr. George A. Romero. So instead of me rambling about my thoughts of the film, why don't we talk a little bit about the pre-production on Day of the Dead? How did we get from Dawn of the Dead to Day of the Dead? Because there is near a 10-year gap between the two films. Dawn of the Dead came out in 78 and Day of the Dead came out in 85. So Romero initially intended on Day of the Dead being much larger in scale compared to the previous two films in the Dead series. He's quoted as saying he intended on Day of the Dead being the Gone with the Wind of zombie movies. Part of Romero's vision would include Day of the Dead being released unrated as to not disrupt his artistic vision. However, disputes with United Artists about releasing the film unrated would result in the budget of Day of the Dead being cut in half. Originally with a budget of $7 million and now being forced to produce Day of the Dead on a budget of $3.5 million, he would force Romero to pull back on the scale of what he had originally envisioned Day of the Dead to be. Throughout the writing process of Day of the Dead, Romero's original idea for the film would become less and less of a reality due to the dwindling budget and continuous rejection of scripts by United Artists. The reason for the continuous rejections on their part was the belief on their end that they couldn't justify a budget the scale of which Romero was asking for, given the fact that it would be released unrated, which would harm its potential return financially at the box office. So, as much as 5 scripts were written for what would become Day of the Dead, with the final one, the script for the film that would eventually be made, I should say, being almost entirely different to Romero's original vision. This apprehension wasn't false founded, given that Day of the Dead would generate only $5.8 million at the box office, less than the originally proposed budget for the film. So, from what I've gathered from watching interviews with Savini and from Romero himself and stuff like that, the scale of which Day of the Dead was originally meant to be huge. Like I just mentioned there, Romero had intended it on being the Gone with the Wind of zombie movies. The only thing, because there was no information about what those original ideas for the script entailed, there was no information online about that I could find anyway. Not to say that it doesn't exist on Blu-ray special features and stuff like that, but I wasn't watching any of those. I was watching things I could find on YouTube and online. But I would imagine, given the very, very start of the movie, if you haven't watched the movie, you'll have no context to what I'm saying, but if you have watched Day of the Dead, you'll know at the very, very start of the movie, the survivors are there, and they're in the center of a city. It's near abandoned, and there's all these real derelict scenes of, like, the newspaper, the wind is catching it up, and it says like the dead walk and all of this crack, and one of the lads is screaming to try and attract some of the zombies, and then hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of zombies come out from the woodworks. And there you have like a zombie alligator as well in that scene. You got the very first zombie you see in the film with his jaw hanging barely attached to the neck. I'd imagine that was originally meant to be the idea for it, was like the last fight or whatever between the living and the dead. And like that was like I'd say that was going to be a tagline and stuff like that. Like, do you know what I mean? Like the dead will have their day or something like that. That it would be the last gasp between the survivors and the dead, because it's mentioned it several times as well throughout the film that the dead outnumber the survivors, like those uninfected by whatever it is that's causing this plague. I think the mad doctor, whose name I can't think of offhand, he said something along the lines that the dead outnumber them 400 to 1 or something like that, maybe even more. So I'd say that was what the premise was going to be. It was going to be like the battle in like a major city between the living and the dead. That's the only sense I can make from it anyway. And it would have been savage. That would have been really, really cool. And from what I've gathered, bits of that premise are touched on in the later Dead movies, which I'm not going to be touching on for a while to come. I watched a retrospective by your man from Cinemassacre there recently about this series, and I can't remember, is it Land of the Dead or the film that follows it, where it's like the rich of the rich live in like this safe haven and stuff like that, and then the outside world and everything like that, it's been overrun by the zombies and stuff like that. So they have the safe haven, and then the zombies kind of evolve to the point where they're like kind of articulate and stuff like that, and they plan like an uprising against them. I'm going to talk a little bit out of my hoop because I haven't seen that film. I'm just somewhat aware of the general premise of it, and I'm just hot taking that elements of that were originally intended for this, which can be seen again, like I just mentioned a minute or two ago. It can be seen at various points throughout this film. You can tell that there's ideas that were originally there's ideas in this movie that are glimpsed over that sound really, really cool when they're mentioned, and you're kind of like, there was definitely more to that than you originally intended. I don't know if I've made a point of talking about this So I'm going to talk about it now before we go any further. I praised Savini like mad for his work on Dawn of the Dead last week. And I have to repeat myself here. From what I've gathered reading up on Savini stuff, because I obviously am new to horror and stuff like that, but this is a visual effects masterpiece. And it's not even like the zombies in this movie. Out of the 3 Dead films, this is when the zombies actually look fucking terrifying. Particularly that scene where I'm going to get onto the plot and stuff like that in a few moments, but when the rafter comes down and the hundreds of the zombies are coming down into the underground cave chambers that the lads are all living in, essentially, that is without a doubt the scariest scene in the trilogy, because you're like, these people are all trapped down here. There's hundreds of zombies about to come down there and maul them, and it's fucking brilliant. And if it had been the same, if there had been the same visual effects for the zombies from Night of the Living Dead or from Dawn of the Dead, maybe you would have gotten away with it with the Dawn of the Dead special effects. It still would have been a little bit scary, but with the visual effects of the zombies in this movie, it's fucking terrifying. It's the first time in the 3 films where I was kind of, oh fuck, right, this real sense of unease watching it. But even more specifically, the reason that I'd call this Savini's, again, I don't know that much about Savini's pictures, being totally honest. I know that he directed the remake of Night of the Living Dead in 1990, and I know that he's involved, like he's an icon in horror for his visual effects and everything like that. But out of all the films that I've seen him be involved in, this is a fucking masterpiece. Particularly, there's one of the army lads dies off screen at the start of the film, and then later on in the film they find that the doctor has been using his corpse to work on, and he basically takes the skull and the skin and the muscles away from the head, and all that's left is like the spine attached to the brain with some nerve endings and stuff like that. And using electrical currents, he reanimates that part of the body, and the brain is still like, it's still moving and stuff like that. And it's just the time and effort that would have went into it. There's another zombie that doctor is working on, who's been cut open and everything like that, the stomach, and he turns around to go and attack him and everything like this. But his like entire internal organs just fall out of his stomach and slap onto the floor like a bag of meat, and it's so impressive. It's so impressive. It's so good. Going back to a scene I just talked about a few moments ago with the undead coming down the rafter and stuff like that into the underground chamber, there was a lot of work done on individual zombies in this film. I would imagine that none of these people offered to do it for free, given the level of makeup that was put on them. Like, you see lads in football jersey, or not football jersey, but like football uniforms, like American football gear, like shoulder pads and stuff. You have a clown zombie walking down the hall when they're all rushing down the hall coming after your man Captain Rhodes. The visual effects as well, like you can tell there's been some zombies who have been dead for a long time that are reanimating, and there's been some zombies who are just dead. There's some whose eyes have like swollen into themselves and stuff like that, and when they get shot it's not blood, it's just absolute green slime comes out the back of them. There's some of them who look fresh as a daisy. It's a great thing about this, and hats off to Savini for this, is no 2 zombies look the same or anything like that, and the gore level in this is multiplied by 10 when compared to the first 2 films. This is an absolute bloodfest at one point, and we're going to touch on that in a few minutes. But before we touch on to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the casting. But actually, before I go and talk about anything else to do with this film, I've already spoiled 1 or 2 bits to do with this film. If you haven't watched this film before, like I said with the last 2 films, I would recommend as always that you check out the movies before listening to any of the podcasts about these movies, because it would make absolutely no sense to not watch these movies and come into a 3-part little special on the show where I just spoil the bejesus out of them. So yeah. Anyway, that is that out of the way, and that is my my adoration for Tom Savini out of the way too. Like, might seem a little bit like I kind of undermine that a small bit, because the visual effects, Jesus Christ, to take center stage in this movie, nearly above the plot. The plot is fantastic and everything like this, but Jesus, every few minutes there is a fantastic special effect at one point or another. and it is all due to Tom Savini and his absolute genius. And I would imagine as these horror podcasts go on over time, I will probably end up dedicating an episode to Savini's work when I know more about him as well. He seems like a really, really interesting guy, and I'm looking forward to reading up on him more when I go on these wiki binges over cans over the course of the coming months. But anyway, let's talk about the casting in Day of the Dead. So we have Laurie Cardle as Dr. Sarah Bowman. She is the daughter of Bill Cardile, who played a reporter in the original Night of the Living Dead. As well as that, we got Joseph Pilato as Captain Rhodes. Pilato's acting debut was in Dawn of the Dead as a police officer. He appeared in several other movies in minor roles, including Pulp Fiction. He's in the background in a scene involving Uma Thurman and John Travolta just before they have the famous dance sequence. I got a good kick out of that when I googled it. As well as that, he also provided English dubs for the Digimon franchise, and he unfortunately passed away in his sleep on March 24, 2019, only 8 days after his 70th birthday. We got Terry Alexander as John Flyboy. He is the Jamaican character in the film. Alexander is mainly remembered for this, and he also appeared mainly in television roles after, including an AIDS PSA. I was going to look and try and see if I get the soundbite of that for you, but unfortunately I couldn't. As well as that, we got, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name right, is it Jeriah Conroy? I should be able to pronounce this. He plays Bill McDermott. He is the alcoholic in the film. He is the stereotypical Irishman in the film, constantly walking around drinking from his silver flask. He appeared in many notable features, including True Grit and several episodes of Law and Order. I was kind of getting a bit annoyed watching this film, because I don't like fucking people stereotyping Irish people or anything like this, because if you stereotype any other if you stereotype any other kind of race in the world, it's a big issue, but it's apparently okay to do that with Irish people, which I don't think is right. And I actually looked, as I was watching the film, I looked up to see who played this fella and everything like that, and he is actually Irish. He's from Galway, which got a good kick out of and everything like that. Because there's some points in the film his accent doesn't sound Irish, so I don't know if they asked him to downplay his accent a little bit or not. But sure, look, I'm not going to get into that. Let's keep ploughing on. We got Richard Liberty as Dr. Matt Frankenstein Logan. So he appeared in one of Romero's other films, The Crazies, which I talked a little bit about last week, and he died in the year 2000 at the age of 68. He has a fantastic performance in this film. And if I was to recommend this film for 3 reasons, it would be Savini special effects, Joseph Pilato as Captain Rhodes, and Richard Liberty as Dr. Matt Frankenstein Logan, because the two of them play their characters absolutely brilliantly. And then last but not least, we got Gary Howard Clare as Steele. He was one of the big brute soldiers for Captain Rhodes. He is the main antagonist, one with the kind of the greyish beard and the matted kind of greyish blondie hair. He is the one who dies by suicide after the swarm kind of come in, and he's running out of bullets. He got one left, and he said he'd rather die by suicide than be eaten by these fuckers, and I don't blame him. If you watch the film, 2 of his mates died just beforehand in the most grisly of circumstances. 2 of the coolest kills I've ever seen in film, and if you saw that in real life, I don't think you'd be long fucking running when these fucking creepy things come down the hall. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the plot for this film. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I am going to read you the plot from Wikipedia, because with Night of the Living Dead, I sat down and I kind of synopsized my own version, everything like this. And what I noticed was it took quite a while. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through the plot on Wikipedia, and then we're going to talk about the movie a little bit more afterwards. Okay, so here we go. A zombie apocalypse has ravaged the entire world, with zombies outnumbering humans 400,000 to 1. So I got that figure wrong anyway. The surviving humans live in security within barricaded camps and secure underground bunkers. In an underground facility in the Everglades, housing scientists and soldiers. The scientists are trying to find a solution to the zombie pandemic. The soldiers have been assigned to protect them. Dr. Sarah Bowman, her lover and soldier Private Miguel Salazar, radio operator Bill McDermott, and helicopter pilot John fly from their underground base to Fort Myers, Florida, in an attempt to locate additional survivors. They only find a large horde of undead, and they return to the base, where they are told that the military detachment officer in charge, Major Cooper, has died. Sarah becomes concerned over Miguel's worsening mental state. Dr. Logan, the lead scientist, whom the soldiers nickname Frankenstein because of his grisly surgical dissections of zombies, believes that the zombies can be made docile by training and conditioning. He's basically trying to domesticate them. He keeps a collection of captive zombies for use as test subjects in a large underground corral in the compound. The angry and reactionary Captain Rhodes and the soldiers that he leads vehemently object to the dangers involved in capturing zombies and keeping them inside the compound. The tensions between soldiers and scientists worsen in the face of dwindling supplies, loss of communications with the survivors, and slow, uncertain progress in research. During a meeting between the scientists and soldiers, Rhodes declares that following the death of Major Cooper, he has taken command of the base. He only grants the scientists some time to prove results and declares that he will execute anyone who interferes with his leadership. He also threatens to abandon the scientists and leave the compound, cutting off their protection from the zombies. Shaken by Rhodes' threats, Sarah goes to the quarters shared by John and Bill to discuss the situation. John professes his conviction that the zombie plague is a form of divine punishment against mankind, that the scientific mission is doomed to failure, and that the effort to preserve records of civilization is pointless. He suggests that the three of them should take the helicopter, abandon the soldiers, and fly to a desert island somewhere where they could live off the land and start a family. Dr. Logan hopes to secure Rhodes' goodwill by showing him the results of his research. Logan is especially proud of Bub, a friendly and non-aggressive zombie who remembers some parts of his past life and engages in rudimentary human behaviour. Listening to music, aiming a pistol, saluting Captain Rhodes, and repeating a string of garbled words. Civility must be rewarded, Logan tells Rhodes. If it's not rewarded, there is no use for it. Rhodes, however, is not impressed. During a zombie roundup mission, a zombie escapes its harness when Miguel loosens his focus, which results in the deaths of two soldiers, Miller and Johnson. Miguel attempts to kill the creature, but another zombie bites him on the arm. After that, he screams in horror and flees as Sarah goes after him. With John and Bill's help, Sarah amputates Miguel's arm and cauterizes it with fire to stop the spreading infection from killing him and reanimating him into a zombie. Rhodes then calls off the experiment and demands that all captive zombies be destroyed, as well as severing any further help from him and his remaining men. Sarah and Bill later discover that Logan has been experimenting on the remains of the dead soldiers, and an audio recording of him rambling to himself through some wires plugged into Johnson's severed head. Fearing that Logan has gone insane and with the conditions worsening, Bill decides that they should leave the compound in the helicopter immediately. Rhodes finds out that Logan has been feeding the flesh of his dead soldiers to Bub as a reward for his docility and positive behaviour. Enraged, Rhodes kills Logan and seizes the remaining scientists and non-military personnel, stripping them of their weapons. Rhodes brings his prisoners and attempts to force John to fly him and his remaining soldiers away from the base, which John refuses to do. In response, Rhodes kills Logan's assistant Fisher, locks Sarah and Bill inside the zombie corral with the zombies, and orders Steele to beat John into submission. Back in Dr. Logan's laboratory, Bub manages to escape from his chains and finds Dr. Logan's corpse. In a display of human emotion, he mourns the loss of his instructor, then picks up a pistol and goes in search of revenge. Meanwhile, a suicidal Miguel heads off unnoticed to the outside fence, where he first opens the gate to allow hundreds of zombies to walk through, and then allows the zombies to begin tearing him apart before he presses the release button that lowers the steel loading gate and gives the zombies access to the base. While he's doing this, John overcomes his captors, steals their weapons, and goes into the zombie corral to rescue Sarah and Bill. As the zombies enter the complex, Rhodes leaves his men behind. Torres and Rickles are killed by the horde, while Steele is bitten and commits suicide. Bub finds Rhodes and fires at him. Rhodes desperately tries to escape, but he runs into a huge mass of zombies and is shot in the stomach by Bub. Bub mockingly salutes Rhodes as the zombies tear him apart. John, Sarah and Bill manage to get to the surface and fly in the helicopter to a deserted island, as John had earlier suggested. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to take an old sup of my cup of tea before we talk any more about this film. Alright, cool. So one thing that I didn't mention with while touching on Savini's work earlier in this film, which is very, very skimmed over in that synopsis of the film, was the gore level of the deaths of all of the soldiers in the climax of this film. Torres and Rickles aren't murdered, or they're not even mauled in this. They just fucking flat out suffer. One of them, the zombies, put their fingers into the socket and rip the head clean from the clean off of the shoulder blades. And a really cool effect that I don't know if it was Savini or Romero thought of this, But as the head is being ripped from the body and stuff like that, and he's screaming, the pitch of the scream actually goes up as if his vocal cords are being stretched. It was a really, really cool little novelty, and I'm going to leave a little delay in here so you can hear it for yourselves. And then as well as that, the other soldier that's killed in that sequence as well, one of the zombies is just scratching with his fingers and his nails and just lifts the eyelid and rips the skin over the eye and everything like this. It's just a very, very cool visual effect. And without a doubt, the scene that most people talk about when it comes to this film is, of course, the death of Captain Rhodes. It's as grotesque gets. Before I started watching these films, when I decided I was going to do a retrospective on them, and after I'd thrown up the post saying I was going to do a retrospective on these, I was having a few cans that evening. Someone commented on it, something in the quote from Rhodes as he's being killed, and that the choke on it quote. And I went to actually see what that scene was. I'm raging in hindsight that I spoiled it for myself before watching the movie, because I think it would have been way more of a shock factor if I'd seen it firsthand while watching the movie. But as he's ripped apart and like his stomach entrails are coming out and everything like that, oh my god, it's beautifully horrific, if that makes any sense. And a really cool fun fact with that scene as well was, I don't know if due to budget cuts or whatever, there was a lot of film students working as stagehands on this in the production of Day of the Dead. Obviously due to budget constraints and stuff like that, naturally. But someone had the job of just making sure these are real. This was all, I think it was at horse meat, or cow meat or whatever they were using. These were actual animal organs and stuff they were using for these scenes, and they were stored in a fridge naturally to keep them fresh and stuff like that, so they wouldn't smell, because rotten meat, for any of you that don't know, is fucking horrific. It's a stench. It's not even that it smells bad. You'll just be gawking if you were near it. But someone I'd say they were cutting for production for the evening. Someone turned off the fridge that these things are being stored in, and it was the day before Rhodes' scene, his death scene, was to be filmed. And credit where credit is due to Joseph Pilato. It took a few hours to film that scene, and there's a load of funny stills to be found on YouTube and on Google of the zombie extras just fanning him down between takes because he is trying not to vomit his ring up, and I don't blame him. Do try and source those out if you can. I got a great kick out of seeing those and I found out about it. But yeah, when it comes to the plot of this is a lot simpler than the last one. It's touched on a bit in Dawn of the Dead, like the contrast between interests of survivors and stuff like that. But in fairness, the 4 survivors in Dawn of the Dead, although they had minor differences and everything like that, they were mainly on the same page throughout. This film more than anything harkens back to the distrust of Night of the Living Dead, where all the survivors are very much, we either follow this person or we follow this person, and that is the divide here. It's the ethical debate of, science above warfare and everything like this. It's kind of like Rhodes and his men kind of think that, if we don't figure out how to sort this out quick, we're all going to die down here. And then the scientists are kind of like, but if we figure out how to sort this out down here, we can sort out how to figure it out everywhere, and it makes it a lot easier for everyone. And the reason that both of them would be so contentious on this is, Rhodes and his men, they've obviously lost friends, they've lost other soldiers and stuff like that. The scientists and everything like that can get that, but they kind of are detached to a certain point as well, because they're kind of like, we're not concerned about like the minority of us, we're concerned about like the whole of society, like, do you know what I mean? I'd be talking out of my hoop if I went into any more detail about that, but watch it for yourselves, and it's very, very apparent from the get-go. Other than that, what else was I going to talk about with this film? I did have a note that I was going to talk about visual effects, but I've talked about that. So let's talk about the release of this film, right? So like I mentioned, it was made on a budget of 3.5 million, and it only would gross 5.8 domestically. Now, there are several reasons for this, right? And I'm going to take another cup of my tea and I'm going to explain why. Oh, it's a lovely cup of tea. Anyway, the reason that the return on this in the box office was so short, it had a limited run in the cinemas due to the fact that it was unrated. Now, it would fare very well internationally and everything like that. It would come to, I think, was it 28.3 million internationally, and it resulted in Day of the Dead grossing around 34 million worldwide, which is very, very good in fairness. Now, a series of mixed reviews from critics, and the fact that, it had a mixed. I'm mixing up all of my notes. So it had a series of mixed reviews from critics in the decades that have gone on since this film has been released. The film is widely praised. It's widely considered to be the last of the classic Romero films, and it's totally understandable why. From what I've gathered, when the series continues on with, I don't know, is it 2005 or 2006 you got Land of the Dead? The films are meant to be fine, but they're never meant to capture the magic of the first three. I've been asked by a few people, will I be covering those films? I will, but you can rest assured after... depending on how I'm doing for time, I have one film that I'd love to watch just to cap off this little bit of a zombie month we've had here on the podcast. And if I have time to do that, that'll be next week's episode. If I don't, we'll figure it out when we get to it. But I will leave it a few months before going back to those other Romero films. And to be honest with you, I would say expect it around Halloween, if even. I have one more horror series that I want to cover. I'm going to give it a few weeks, maybe even a month or two before I go at that one. That's going to be a single episode retrospective about one specific horror series that I'm not going to touch on yet. I was supposed to record that over the past few weeks with two mates, but given the fact that my laptop's been on the shitter, it's not really possible to record it yet. But we got one more series to cover. I have one more series in mind, and it's quite similar to this one, but I won't say anything that's won't spoil it. Getting back to the Day of the Dead. Mixed reviews from critics. It's idolised in hindsight by a lot of people, and rightly so. This is a great film, and again, I highly recommend that you check it out. An interesting fact that it peaked on number 23 on the VHS Billboard Top 100 a year after its release. It's George Romero's favourite of the three original Dead movies, and there wouldn't be a sequel to Day of the Dead for several decades after. And it's understandable why. Watching that Cinemassacre Dead movie retrospective I was telling you about a few minutes ago, your man, I don't know his name, James, I can't think of it offhand. He's a big horror nut, and he specifies that 85 is kind of when zombie movies peaked. You got Return of the Living Dead, comes out this year as well. There's a few more that I just can't think of for the life of me. The Return of the Living Dead series as well, I've been asked by a few people, that will be covered as well, but just give me time. This is a metal podcast at the end of the day as well, and we got to get back to the metal at some point. We've spent a month now talking about zombies, so we gotta get to that. That's pretty much everything I have to say about Day of the Dead. If I could give you my own personal thoughts on it, I think I've given you quite a bit throughout the course of this podcast already. Is it my favourite of the three? No, but you know something, to be quite honest with you, I still do consider Night of the Living Dead, to be one of my favourite films of all time. I will say that this and Dawn are... I was about to say they're tied. They're not tied. I prefer Dawn very, very slightly to this one. If you had Dawn of the Dead with the visual effects of this film, I think you'd have a fucking perfect zombie movie. This is a great film though. And me saying that I don't prefer to the other two, that's not a knock on it at all. My preference to Dawn of the Dead is strictly over the plot. I could easily see why people would prefer this one to Dawn of the Dead as well. And they're very, very close in quality. When it comes to the three movies, comparing them and contrasting them and stuff like that, there's not really that much you can compare and contrast, to be quite honest with you, outside of a few things. There's social commentary to be found on all of them. I'm not qualified to talk about the social commentary on them. I thought I would be a few weeks ago. I thought I'd get to a point where I'd be talking about the three movies at the end of this little retrospective, and I'd be like, oh, you can see this in this film and you can see that in that film. And to be quite honest with you, I've watched video essays about the social commentaries in this or in these movies. I've listened to podcasts of people have hot takes about things to do with these movies and everything like that. I will say the best way that I can compare and contrast these movies is that every single one of these reflects the decade they're made in perfectly. Night of the Living Dead is a great reflection of the 60s, Dawn of the Dead is a great reflection of the 70s, and in equal measure Day of the Dead is a great reflection of the 80s. The quality, you can obviously say that the quality of each movie improves and everything like that as they go on and stuff like that. I would make the argument that Dawn of the Dead Dawn of the Dead for me is the best plot and premise out of the three. Yeah, I don't know. This is one of those things. I would love to sit down with people who are better educated about these movies and look back at the three of them retrospectively, because I planned on doing that at the end of this episode. But to be quite honest with you, I think if I was to do that, I'd really be talking out of my hoop to a certain extent. I've seen Dawn of the Dead twice. I've watched Day of the Dead once, and I've watched Night of the Living Dead at least 15 times in my life. Do you know what I mean? So I wouldn't be able to give a fair compare and contrast either. So I might do that. I might I have it, like I said earlier in the podcast, I have a bit of free time coming up over the next few weeks. I may get in contact with some mates who are more familiar with this, and we may throw together a bonus episode of the show, given that I'm going to have some free time. But then again, you know me, don't hold my word to it. Because I could say this now and I could land a new job in 2 weeks' time, and I might never have time to do anything like that. It may have to be the way it is. I don't know. Talking out of my hoop. It's too early in the week for this crack. Recording this too early in the week. Anyway, so that's the end of our Romero Dead retrospective on the show. I've had a load of fun looking back at these movies. These are definitely movies I'm going to revisit more and more again. I've watched, like I said, Night of the Living Dead countless times. Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead are definitely movies I'm going to be revisiting over the next few years a lot more and stuff like that. I really, really enjoy these. I am looking forward to going through the four remaining movies in the series. It kicks back off with Land of the Dead about 20 years later, and then I think it concludes with I think it's a Diary of the Dead. I could have that wrong, but I know there's 4 more movies. I'll probably dig into those towards the end of the summer now, because after the past few weeks I'm kind of full now when it comes to my zombie fix. So I think I'll be good again until Halloween. But like I said, I got one more movie that was randomly suggested to me that I think would make for a fun little novelty podcast, and if I have the time to sit down and watch it this week, it will be next week's episode of the show. But if it's not, I'll sit down here and I'll talk about metal for an hour, as I'm supposed to be doing. This is a metal podcast and stuff like that. Yeah, so like I said, this is the end of the Romero retrospectives. This is the end of the first horror retrospective on the channel. Let me know what you guys thought of this. Again, this is my first time doing a retrospective about horror movies and stuff like that, so it was probably a little bit hit or miss at times. Kind of have to figure out a format for these and stuff like that. As well as that, I'd say what I'm going to do going forward is I know for the next franchise I'm tackling, I'm going to be having guests on and we're going to do it in one episode. I am going to do my best to not allow franchises to take over a few weeks of the podcast like the Romero ones have. But yeah, because I know like one of the series suggested for me to check out would be Hellraiser. There's about 8 or 9 films in that franchise. Don't really have imagine me dedicating 8 or 9 episodes to Hellraiser. I'm going to have a few guests on and we're going to talk about Hellraiser at some point. Someone was asking me what franchises I want to cover. I'm going to tell you what I want to cover. That doesn't mean that they're all going to be covered before the end of the year. I know what the next one's going to be, and I know the next one will probably be August, I'd say, is when that retrospective will come out. I'll give you a clue. It's a trilogy. And it's very, very similar to the franchise I just covered, but that's about all I'm going to tell you. Other than that, I would love to sit down and talk about The Omen. The Omen is a film I know pretty well. I'd love to sit down and talk about that with some people. The Exorcist. Actually, since I mentioned The Omen, if I was going to talk about The Omen, I'd probably sit down and watch Omen 1 or Omen 2 and 3. I've never watched those before. That might be a bit of crack. The Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, I'd love to tackle that. Currently sitting across from a copy of The Hills Have Eyes. I've had that DVD for about 3 years and I've yet to watch it. I'll probably do an episode about that. We got loads and loads of horror films. Like I said, I'm a noob to the genre. I know absolutely nothing about it. So it's going to be a lot of fun to learn more about horror over the course of the coming months and stuff like that. But that being said, a lot of people since starting these retrospectives have been like, where are the metal podcasts? I listen to this because it's a metal podcast. I don't want to be talking about horror. I don't want to be listening to stuff about horror movies. And it reflected in the listenership a small bit. There was a little bit of dip in the listenership over the last 2 weeks, but that's expected. I do this podcast for fun, like I said, so I don't really mind if the listenership dips that much and everything like that. But yeah, what I'd say for next week, don't expect anything because it could very well change. But I am hoping to do one little novelty horror movie next week if I get the time, which I think I will. I'm recording this pretty early in the week. This will be put out on Friday, so I got a little over a week to sit down, watch that film, and talk about it. I might try and get 1 or 2 guests on for that if my laptop comes back if it comes back this week. Anyway, I'm just talking out of my hoop now. It's the end of the show, so I'm just talking out of my hoop. So yeah, Please let me know what you thought of these retrospectives. Let me know how they could be improved in any way. Let me know what franchises you'd like to see me and some guests talk about in the future. And as well as that, if you probably do listen to this podcast for the metal podcast and stuff like that. If there is bands you want me to talk about, if there's movements, if there's movements you'd like me to talk about, if there are historic moments in metal you'd like me to talk about, let me know. I got one or two in mind for the first metal podcast back, which should be either the week after next or it might be next week if I don't get time to watch that movie. It'll be a fun little 40-minute retrospective look back at something very, very silly in hindsight that happened in the 80s, but it seemed like the end of the world at the time. But we'll cross that bridge and talk about it a little more when we get to it. Lads, thank you very much as always for listening to another episode of the From the Depths podcast. As always, my name has been Emmett, and I'll see you next week on the show. Good night and God bless.